Have you ever wondered what it takes to connect with someone no one else can reach? No one could handle the Millionaire's autistic twins until the Black Maid's 14-year-old daughter did the impossible. "What the hell are you doing in my office?" Richard Blackwell's voice cut through the silence like a knife, echoing off the mahogany walls of his Connecticut mansion. He stopped in the doorway, his $3,000 suit rumpled from a delayed flight, and found a scene that left him completely speechless. In the center of the office, sitting on the Italian marble floor, was Livia Santos, only 14 years old. Around her, 6-year-old twins Thomas and Timothy Blackwell played quietly with building blocks. Their anxiety attacks seemingly evaporated into thin air. For the first time in months, there were no screams, no broken objects, no desperate tears. Could a teenager hold the key to a mystery that baffled experts? Livia looked up calmly, her braids disheveled from playing, but her gaze steady as if she had weathered far worse storms. "They were having a meltdown, Mr. Blackwell. Their mother had to go out to get some medicine and asked me to stay with them." Donna Carmen Santos had worked as the family's housekeeper for 5 years, always keeping her daughter away from her employers. Livia knew the mansion well and had plenty of places to hide while she waited for her mother to finish work. But today, something had changed everything. 15 specialized nannies, Richard muttered, watching his autistic children interact naturally for the first time since his troubled divorce. 15 therapists with doctorates, renowned specialists, and none of them could do this. Thomas, who hadn't spoken to strangers in 2 years, whispered something in Livia's ear. She smiled and replied softly, making the boy giggle genuinely. Timothy, who normally rocked compulsively when anxious, was completely relaxed, methodically and calmly organizing blocks by color. "How?" Richard asked, more to himself than to her. Livia rose slowly, her worn sneakers contrasting with the luxurious surroundings. "They don't need to be fixed, Mr. Blackwell. They just need to be understood." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. But Richard had no way of knowing that Livia had grown up caring for her autistic cousin in a community where specialized resources were unattainable luxuries. "Get out." The word came out harsher than he intended. "Get out of my house now and take your mother with you." Livia nodded silently, but as she headed for the door, Thomas began to cry. It wasn't a normal tantrum. It was the sound of a child losing the only person who had been able to understand his particular language in the last few months. "Please," Timothy whispered, the first word he had spoken in weeks. "Don't go." Richard watched the scene, his anger mixed with something he couldn't name. For a moment, he saw his children not as problems to be managed, but as children who had finally found someone who spoke their language. But his wounded pride spoke louder. A teenager from the suburbs had achieved in one afternoon what experts had failed to do in months, and that was unacceptable. "Out now." As Livia walked down the marble hallway, she carried on her shoulders not only the injustice of the moment, but a secret Richard would never imagine. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated because of her age and background. And it wouldn't be the last time she proved she was on the right side of history. But what no one in that mansion could have predicted was that this forced farewell would plant the seed of a transformation that would not only change the lives of the Blackwell twins, but expose truths about prejudice and competence that Connecticut's elite preferred to keep hidden. If this story of overcoming adversity and justice touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to Black Voices channel to find out how a simple afternoon of caregiving would become the catalyst for changes that no adult in that mansion was prepared to face. The dismissal came at the worst possible time. Carmen Santos looked at the envelope with 2 weeks' pay, a generous gesture from Richard as he made sure to emphasize while mentally calculating how she would pay the overdue rent and her diabetic father's medication. "Mom, we'll be fine," whispered Livia. But her words sounded more like a promise than a consolation. She had grown up accustomed to instability, moving from house to house since she was 8, always one step ahead of eviction or the next financial crisis. Richard, of course, wasted no time in hiring the 16th specialized nanny. This time, a German woman with a PhD in child psychology and international consulting fees. "We're going to do things right this time," he said on the phone with the agency loud enough for Carmen to hear as she packed his belongings. "I want someone with real credentials, not amateurs." The irony did not escape Livia. Real credentials. As if years of caring for her autistic cousin, Miguel, learning on the job that every child had his own unique language, were less valid than framed diplomas. As if growing up in a community where adaptation and creativity were matters of survival, taught nothing about resilience. 3 days later, Carmen's phone rang. It was Richard, his voice tense. The German specialist lasted 6 hours. The boys broke the $70,000 television and Timothy locked himself in the closet. "I need you to come back temporarily." Carmen hesitated. "What about my daughter?" "Your daughter stays at home. I don't want teenagers wandering around the property unsupervised." Livia watched her mother hang up the phone. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "It was always like this. The rich called you back when they needed you, but always with new humiliating rules, new reminders of your social place. As if competence was something you could buy with money, not something you developed through necessity and genuine love." "It won't work without you there," Carmen murmured, looking out the window of the small apartment. "They trust you." "I know, Mom. And he knows it, too." That night, Livia did something she had learned years ago. When social workers tried to separate her from her mother, she began to document everything, every conversation, every interaction, every proof that true expertise had nothing to do with expensive degrees or important last names. She had grown up knowing that people like Richard Blackwell only respected one language: public consequences. Her own history had taught her that when she was forced to testify in court at age 12, defending her right to stay with her mother against a system that automatically assumed poverty equal incompetence. While her mother returned every day to the mansion, facing condescending looks and passive-aggressive comments about professional standards, Livia began to research. Richard Blackwell wasn't just rich. He sat on educational boards, spoke publicly about excellence in childcare, and had a carefully constructed reputation as a devoted father and philanthropist. A reputation that depended entirely on keeping certain truths out of the spotlight. The breaking point came on Friday. Carmen came home with red eyes after Richard berated her in front of the new Swiss nanny, the 17th attempt for interfering with approved methods when she tried to calm Timothy during a meltdown. He said, "I was sabotaging professional protocols because I knew Thomas calms down when he listens to soft Brazilian music," Carmen said, as if knowing what calms a child is a crime. Livia nodded silently, but her eyes sparkled with something Carmen couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more calculated. It was the look of someone who had learned early on that the world doesn't offer justice for free. Sometimes you have to build it with your own hands. "Mom," Livia said finally. "Do you still have the house keys?" Carmen frowned. "Why?" "Because it's time for Mr. Blackwell to learn the difference between real competence and inherited privilege." At that moment, as she silently planned every move she would make in the coming weeks, Livia carried with her a secret Richard would never suspect. She hadn't just observed his interactions with the twins that fateful afternoon. She had recorded everything on her cell phone, from his condescending conversation with her mother to the exact moment when the boys finally calmed down with her unlicensed techniques. What no adult in that mansion understood was that Livia Santos had grown up in a world where documenting injustice wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And now, with the right tools and motivation, she was about to teach the powerful Richard Blackwell a lesson that not even all the money in the world could buy. Never underestimate someone who has as much to prove as they have to lose. The first week after Carmen's permanent dismissal was a complete disaster for Richard Blackwell. The 18th specialized nanny, this time a Brazilian woman with a master's degree in neuropsychology, lasted exactly 43 minutes before running out of the mansion gates crying. "You have to understand, Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Patricia Mendoza explained over the phone, still panting. "Your children don't have a common behavioral disorder. They are in deep mourning, and any attempt to force protocols only intensifies the trauma. Those who have been able to connect with them understand something that we, with all our degrees, have lost sight of." Richard hung up the phone in anger. Carmen had been the only employee who had managed to keep the boys somewhat stable, but to admit that publicly would be to acknowledge that an uneducated maid was more competent than renowned experts. His pride would not allow it. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Livia Santos was sitting in the city's public library, connected to the free Wi-Fi, methodically researching every aspect of Richard Blackwell's public life. Articles about his company, photos at social events, interviews where he spoke pompously about excellence in family care and investment in qualified professionals. Interesting, she murmured, saving a 3-month-old article where Richard publicly criticized public schools for lack of adequate professional standards. In the same article, he advocated mandatory testing for teachers and questioned whether people without adequate training should be responsible for child development. Livia smiled ironically. Hypocrisy had an expiration date and his was about to expire. That was when she met Dr. Miguel Santos. No relation, just a coincidence of surnames. He was a child psychologist specializing in autism. Recently fired from a private clinic after questioning methods he considered harmful to children. He was now working as a volunteer at an NGO on the outskirts of town, exactly where Livia had grown up. "You describe techniques that take me years to teach my residents," said Dr. Miguel after Livia explained how she had managed to calm the twins. "Where did you learn that?" "Necessity," she replied simply. "My cousin Miguel is autistic. I learned that every child has his own language. There is no magic formula, just patience and real observation." Dr. Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know that techniques like yours are considered the international gold standard? What you did instinctively has a name: responsive sensory intervention. It is effective precisely because it starts from the child's real needs, not from rigid protocols." Livia felt something click into place in her mind. "Doctor, what would happen if someone with money and influence were publicly confronted with evidence that they are harming children because of prejudice?" "It would depend on the evidence," he replied carefully. "But if it were properly documented, well, there are ethical and legal consequences for proven negligence in childcare." That night, Livia created a fake social media profile and began discreetly commenting on Richard's posts about child development. Nothing aggressive, just intelligent questions that exposed contradictions in his public statements about professional competence. Meanwhile, through Carmen, she learned that Richard had started medicating the twins to control their anxiety against the pediatrician's recommendation to first try non-invasive behavioral approaches. "The drugs are turning them into zombies," Carmen confessed, exhausted. "Thomas can barely concentrate enough to play, and Timothy spent the whole day staring at the wall, but he won't listen. He says pharmacological solutions are more reliable than empirical methods." Livia documented everything: every medication prescribed, every specialist hired and fired, every arrogant statement Richard made about professional standards. She was building a dossier that would publicly expose how prejudice disguised as elitism was harming two vulnerable children. The opportunity came when Richard announced on social media that he would be speaking at a seminar on excellence in childcare for high-income families. The event would be broadcast live with questions from the audience. Dr. Miguel rolled his eyes when he saw the announcement. This man is going to talk about excellence while medicating children unnecessarily because he's afraid to admit that a teenager from the suburbs understands more about his children's needs than expensive specialists. "Doctor," said Livia with that smile that Carmen had learned to recognize as a sign that something important was being planned. "How about we ask some very well-founded questions during this lecture?" Dr. Miguel looked at her intently. There was something about the determination of this 14-year-old girl that reminded him why he had chosen to work with children. Sometimes true wisdom came from unexpected places. And the greatest injustice was when those in power tried to silence voices that had something real to say. "What kind of questions?" he asked, already imagining the answer. Livia opened her notebook filled with notes, quotes from Richard's own articles, and data on the method she had used successfully, the kind that will publicly expose the difference between real competence and arrogance disguised as knowledge. While they carefully planned each question that would be asked during the live broadcast, Richard Blackwell slept peacefully in his mansion, confident that he had finally solved the problem of inappropriate influences in his home. He had no way of knowing that the teenager he had underestimated was about to turn his own lecture into the stage for his greatest public humiliation. In the next room, Thomas and Timothy slept under the influence of medication that made their dreams hazy. While across town, a 14-year-old girl finalized a plan that would show the whole world what true childcare looked like, and who should really be talking about excellence in that field. The auditorium of the luxurious Plaza Hotel was packed. 200 of Connecticut's elite professionals had gathered to hear Richard Blackwell speak on excellence in childcare for high-income families. The live broadcast cameras captured every detail. The $5,000 suit, the confident smile, the posture of someone who had never been questioned in public. Childcare is not a field for amateurs, Richard declared, adjusting his microphone. Investing in credentialed professionals is investing in the future of our children. We cannot allow sentimentality to replace scientific competence. In the audience, Dr. Miguel Santos raised his hand politely. Mr. Blackwell, that's an interesting perspective. Can you tell us about the practical results of that philosophy with your own children? Richard smiled condescendingly. Of course, my twins have access to the best international specialists, psychologists with PhDs, certified therapists, FDA-approved pharmacological methods, and the results are satisfactory. Dr. Miguel insisted, discreetly consulting his notes. Obviously, science doesn't lie, does it, Doctor? Dr. Santos, and I agree. Science doesn't really lie. That's why I'd like to share some interesting data. Richard frowned as Dr. Miguel stood up. Recent studies show that autistic children respond better to caregivers who demonstrate genuine emotional connection regardless of formal credentials. In fact, forcing rigid protocols can intensify existing trauma. The audience murmured, interested. Richard felt the first chill down his spine. That's very theoretical, he countered, trying to regain control. In practice, structured methods are more reliable. That's when a young voice echoed from the back of the auditorium. Mr. Blackwell, may I ask a question? All heads turned. Livia Santos walked down the center aisle, carrying a tablet and wearing a portable microphone that Dr. Miguel had obtained in advance. At 14, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, she looked completely out of place among the suited professionals. I'm sorry, but this event is for registered experts, Richard said, visibly uncomfortable. I'm Livia Santos, daughter of your former housekeeper. The same person you fired after I calmed Thomas and Timothy down in 20 minutes. Something 18 accredited experts couldn't do in months. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. The live cameras focused on Livia, who walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. This is ridiculous, Richard stammered. Security. Wait, said Dr. Miguel, standing up again. Let her speak. As a doctor, I'm curious about the methods that worked when the traditional ones failed. Livia took the stage, ignoring Richard's protests. I'd like to show everyone here a video I recorded that afternoon. On the screen appeared a recording of the twins during one of their worst crises. Thomas screaming, Timothy rocking compulsively, furniture overturned. Then Livia's calm voice began to sing softly a Brazilian song. Gradually, the boys calmed down, drew closer to each other, and finally fell asleep peacefully. Responsive sensory technique, Dr. Miguel commented loudly enough to be heard. International gold standard. Now, Livia continued, I would like to show you the result of Mr. Blackwell's scientific methods. The next video showed the twins under the influence of heavy medication. Their eyes vacant, their movements slow, clearly pharmacologically suppressed. The audience was visibly shocked. Murmurs of disapproval began to grow. Stop this immediately, Richard yelled, trying to turn off the projector. I'm not finished yet, said Livia calmly. Dr. Miguel, can you explain the long-term effects of unnecessary medication on autistic children? Delayed cognitive development, chemical dependency, suppression of natural personality, replied Dr. Miguel, addressing the camera. Especially when used as a first line of treatment rather than behavioral approaches. Richard was pale, sweating visibly. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly, Livia interrupted, showing prints on her tablet. Here are your own words in recent interviews. People without proper training should not have responsibility for child development. And here empirical methods are dangerous when applied by amateurs. She turned to the audience. The same man who said that is unnecessarily medicating two children because he is ashamed to admit that a teenager from the suburbs understands more about his children's needs than specialists who charge $4,000 a session. The auditorium exploded in indignant conversation. Professionals looked at each other, clearly disturbed by the evidence presented. Lies, Richard shouted. Emotional manipulation. Dr. Miguel, Livia said, can you confirm the authenticity of the medical reports I obtained through my mother? Dr. Miguel examined the documents on his tablet. Prescriptions for anti-anxiety and antipsychotic drugs for 6-year-old children against express pediatric recommendation. That's problematic. A journalist in the audience stood up. Mr. Blackwell, how do you respond to accusations that you are harming your own children out of prejudice? Richard looked around desperately. The audience that had applauded him minutes earlier now looked at him with suspicion and disgust. Live cameras broadcast his humiliation to thousands of people. You don't understand, he repeated, his voice breaking. I only wanted the best for them. The best would be to put your pride aside and admit that competence cannot be bought with money, Livia replied. Your children deserve someone who sees them as children, not as problems to be controlled with drugs. Dr. Miguel approached the microphone. As president of the Regional Association of Child Psychology, I announce that we will be opening a formal investigation into the care described here today. Richard staggered, finally realizing the magnitude of what was happening. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was being torn apart live on television by a teenager he had completely underestimated. You, he whispered, staring at Livia with hatred and admiration. You planned all this. Livia smiled for the first time that night, a smile that mixed sadness and determination. No, Mr. Blackwell, you planned it. I just documented it. As Richard was escorted out of the auditorium amid camera flashes and hostile questions from journalists, a single question hung in the air. Was it possible that a man who had spent years building a fortress of privilege and arrogance could face the reality that he had been brought down not by force or money, but by the simple truth that underestimating someone based on prejudice can cost much more than just a reputation? 3 months after his public humiliation at the Plaza Hotel, Richard Blackwell's life had become a carefully documented nightmare. The Regional Association of Child Psychology's investigation resulted in a devastating report that was leaked to the press. Systematic parental neglect disguised as medical elitism. The process of losing temporary custody of the twins was swift and brutal. Thomas and Timothy were placed in the care of social workers while Richard faced not only public humiliation, but also investigations by the Child Protection Board into the inappropriate use of medication on minors. 15 experts fired in 6 months, medication against pediatric advice, systematic refusal of proven methods. Dr. Miguel Santos read the official report during a televised interview. The most ironic thing is that the solution was literally right there in the house in the form of an exceptionally talented teenager whom he fired out of prejudice. Richard tried to hire the best lawyers in Connecticut, but found that his reputation had become toxic. Videos of the confrontation at the Plaza Hotel circulated on social media with millions of views, always accompanied by devastating comments about privilege versus real competence. His consulting firm lost millions of dollars in contracts when clients began to publicly question, if he can't take care of his own children, how can he advise other families on excellence? Meanwhile, Livia Santos had become a minor local celebrity. Invitations to speak came in weekly. Schools, universities, NGOs wanted to hear from the teenager who had exposed how prejudice disguised as professional standards can harm the very children it is supposed to protect. The most important thing wasn't the applause, Livia explained during an interview on community radio. It was seeing Thomas and Timothy finally getting the care they always deserved. Now they have a team that sees them as unique children, not as problems to be medicated into submission. Dr. Miguel had become Livia's official mentor, helping her structure a training program for community caregivers. She has instinctively developed techniques that take us years to teach in college, he explained to impressed colleagues. We need to stop assuming that competence comes only from expensive degrees. The most visible transformation, however, was in the Santos family itself. Carmen had been hired as a home care coordinator at a prestigious clinic with a salary 3 times higher than her previous one. Practical experience supervising complex cases of childhood autism, read her new resume, validated by Dr. Miguel. Livia had received a full scholarship to study child psychology at Yale University with a guaranteed internship at the Neurodiverse Development Research Lab. At 14, she would be the youngest student ever accepted into the program. "Some people are born with diplomas, others are born with purpose," she said during her last lecture before starting college early. "I found that purpose is worth a lot more." Richard's fate, however, continued its downward spiral. He had lost permanent custody of the twins after a hearing where 3 independent experts confirmed that Livia's techniques were not only adequate but superior to the methods he had insisted on using. Thomas and Timothy now lived with a foster family specializing in neurodivergent children, but they maintained regular visits with Carmen and Livia, the only people who had truly connected with them during the most difficult times. "Dad was trying to fix us," Thomas explained to the social worker during one of the evaluations. "But Livia knew we weren't broken." The final irony came when Richard, desperate to rebuild some credibility, tried to enroll in a basic course on caring for autistic children. The course instructor was Dr. Livia Santos, and the course materials included case studies based on the techniques Livia had developed intuitively. "It's funny how life works," Carmen remarked during the dinner celebrating Livia's scholarship. "He spent thousands trying to find someone who understood the boys. And the answer was here all along." Livia smiled, looking out the window of her new apartment, much more spacious, in a better neighborhood, but not ostentatious. "It wasn't about having the answer, Mom. It was about him having the courage to listen." Months later, when Livia was settled in at Yale, she received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard Blackwell, handwritten in shaky handwriting. "Livia, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know you were right from day one. My pride cost my children years of unnecessary suffering. They are fine now, and that is thanks to you, not me. Thank you for not giving up on them, even when I gave up on you." Livia folded the letter carefully and put it in her drawer. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about justice. And justice, she had learned, wasn't about destroying those who hurt you. It was about building something so big and true that it was impossible to ignore your competence again. 2 years later, Dr. Livia Santos, yes, she had skipped several academic steps due to her exceptional practical demonstration, founded the first community clinic specializing in autism that prioritized caregivers with lived experience over traditional credentials. Richard Blackwell tried to apply to work there as a volunteer. His application was denied, not out of revenge, but because he had not yet fully understood that true excellence in childcare begins with the humility to recognize that wisdom can come from anywhere. Livia Santos' greatest revenge was not destroying Richard Blackwell. It was to prove that a teenager from the suburbs could build something more valuable and lasting than all of his privileged arrogance put together. Thomas and Timothy grew up healthy. Thomas became a musician and Timothy a children's illustrator. Both working today with neurodivergent children, perpetuating the cycle of genuine understanding that Livia had started. If this story of overcoming adversity has touched you, subscribe to Black Voices channel to discover more real stories about how true competence always beats empty privilege and how sometimes justice comes exactly when we least expect it, but always when we need it.